Okay, let's get started. So once again, thank you for joining today. I think it's a really good turnout, and as I said before, I think it shows how resonant this topic is, and we'll go into that shortly. As I say, I will be pausing for questions in the middle and the end, at the end of the presentation. So I'm guessing that if you're joining today, that you experience imposter syndrome or relate to imposter syndrome to some degree. So what we'll cover, first of all, we'll cover an understanding of what imposter syndrome is, where it comes from, how it manifests, and once we understand that, if we understand that, it makes something easier to overcome. A lot of what I'm talking about will be related to my own experience and also to experiences that my clients have had that I coach, or people that I've worked with in the past. Obviously, if I'm talking about other people, I'm not going to mention any names for confidentiality reasons, but a lot of it will relate to my own experience. But anybody can experience imposterism. So even though I said this is a webinar for managers, hopefully there's something in this for everyone. So just to introduce myself for those who don't know me, first of all, my name is Matt Anson. And I'm an imposter. So welcome to Imposters Anonymous. I've over 20 years of management and leadership experience, mainly in tech sales, but I also, my first management role was actually in fast food, in a very famous fast food company beginning with an M. The last role before I launched my coaching business was as the leader of the Dublin and Lisbon offices of N3 Results. There are a couple of people on here today from N3. They're an outsourced sales company that do outsourced sales and marketing for mainly tech companies, the likes of Microsoft, Cisco. I know there are a couple of people on from Cisco here today, so welcome. But what I do now is I work with managers to build on their strengths, progress their careers, using that experience and combining that with the latest coaching and training techniques. But I think the most important thing and the most relevant thing for today is that I've spent all of those working years living and coping with imposter syndrome. And it's been a very strong experience for me. So what is imposter syndrome? So the term imposter syndrome was first used by two women psychologists in 1978 from the US, although at the time they termed it imposter phenomenon. And it's a belief that you're not as competent as others perceive you to be, and that you're unable to fully accept your successes. When it was introduced, and the reason I mentioned that the two psychologists were women, it was thought to only apply to high achieving women. But since then, studies have shown that it's more widely experienced. And as we'll see, the higher the position we go in a company, the more likely that person is to suffer from imposter syndrome. I'm keen to point out that it's not a mental illness. As we see, it can be a cause of mental illness, it can be a cause of anxiety and depression, but psychologists are clear to call it out. It's not a mental illness, it's an emotional experience. So really then, it's not technically a syndrome. And maybe the original term of imposter phenomenon is a better term, or maybe imposterism. But today's session, I'm just going to use the term imposter syndrome because it's the one we're all familiar with. And that's what I call it. And people who are experiencing it, I may refer to them once or twice as imposters, in inverted commas. They usually apply imposter syndrome to academic or professional environments, but it can also manifest in social circles. If you have a high achieving group of friends, or you go out for dinner with a group of high achievers, imposter syndrome can manifest there and in a lot of other places. So how common is it? So there have been a lot of studies since that initial study in 1978, and they show on average that at least 80% of adults have experienced imposter syndrome at some point in their lives and at some point in their careers. And certainly with my coaching clients, it's very unusual. In fact, I can't think of any coaching clients that I've had that it hasn't come up in some way, shape or form during our coaching. I ran a poll, and those of you who are connected to me on LinkedIn may have seen this. I ran a poll on imposter syndrome a couple of weeks ago. And if you look at the results there, from 116 votes, 69% of respondents said that they identified with imposter syndrome in some way, 49% very much or completely identifying it. And if you think about a LinkedIn network, it's a network of professionals. It's a network generally of, especially if people who are active on LinkedIn, of people who want to be high achievers or who already are high achievers. So if you think about 49% of the people, of those people suffering or experiencing imposter syndrome from that kind of network. So if you think and extend this onto yourself, think about what this means. Let's say you're a manager sitting in a manager's meeting with 8 other managers and your leader. So there are 10 of you in total in that meeting. And you're sitting there in that meeting feeling like the imposter. You're feeling like you shouldn't be there. You're feeling like you're a fraud. But statistically, at least half of the people in the room are feeling exactly the same way. They're experiencing the same emotional experience. They're experiencing imposter syndrome. And you know that manager, that boss, that leader that you report to that you think has it all together and you're afraid of coming across as a fraud to, there's a really good chance, it's probably more likely, that that person is also experiencing imposter syndrome or at least familiar with imposter syndrome. So where does imposter syndrome come from? What do we think the causes are? So maybe pop something in the chat. Let me ask you some questions. What do you think the causes of imposter syndrome are? Just maybe type something in the chat if you can think of root causes of imposter syndrome. Low self-esteem, yeah, definitely. Social media, interesting, yeah, but actually think about that. Lack of confidence, depression, yeah, lack of formal education, previous rejection, background, comparison with others. So these are all great. So thank you, and thanks for giving me the answers there. But if so, same lack of formal education and or training to do the current role, absolutely. So there are a lot of causes and a lot of root causes of imposter syndrome, and it's going to be different for everybody. I've looked, well, I haven't studied in depth, but I've seen almost 300 studies. Some I've looked at high level, some I have looked at in depth of imposter syndrome in different environments, in different countries, different backgrounds. And they suggest a wide variety of causes. So just to pick out a few from here, and we've touched on some of these already in the chat there, so thank you for that. So families, so family background. People who come from families may be characterized by high levels of conflict, or maybe a violent background. So people who had a low level of support in their childhood or experienced, had a family with alcohol or substance abuse. But on the opposite side of that, those with high achieving families or over controlling parents, so maybe families who their parents cared too much or had too high ambitions for them. So that can work both ways. One study showed that children who had to take on an adult role, so let's say one of their parents died while they were young, or they had to be a carer for one of their parents, or they were the eldest in a large family or a large group of children, they are 30% more likely to suffer from imposter syndrome during their adult life. Also, regarding upbringing in schools, how criticism was given in school or in the family. Let's say you, as a child, you failed a spelling test. If the criticism was you didn't try hard or you didn't focus at that test, then that has a temporary effect. But if you're constantly told that it was your ability rather than your effort, that you weren't good enough, then this can have an impact in later life on how you perceive yourself. If you're also constantly, and again, it works the other way, if you were constantly told you were great at everything, and you were constantly being bigged up by your parents, then anything but the best can be seen in your eyes as an adult as a failure. Cultural, for instance, I saw Carlos from New Jersey there, so this is a US study, but the US studies show that Asian Americans were more likely to experience imposter syndrome than other ethnic groups. So again, there may be a cultural effect there. So I mentioned there race, sexual preference, age, anything that makes you feel different from the majority can also cause imposter syndrome. Now I mentioned gender there, and we mentioned gender in the studies earlier. Imposter syndrome affects men and women equally, but for different reasons. Again, if you're a woman in a male-dominated environment, that can definitely be a cause. And what that can also manifest, particularly, and does also manifest particularly in women more than men, is fear of success as much as fear of failure, especially if you're, as I say, in a male-dominated environment. For men, fear of failure tends to be the larger driver. And imposter syndrome can be temporary. I saw Ronan's on the call today, but I know we were discussing this in a LinkedIn chat. I think it was part of the follow-up to my poll, that it can be a temporary thing. So if you're in a new role or you're in a company and you're consciously incompetent, but the issue is that a lot of people still feel incompetent after years in the same company, years in the same role, even if those around them are still telling them they're great. A lot of it, and so I can't remember who was said in the chat, but somebody said about comparisons, and this is a huge thing. So many of us can immediately think of a leader or a manager or a role model they look up to when somebody says great manager or great example of your role. And then we use that person to measure ourselves against. I know certainly there's a manager that a leader that I had in my days I used to work for Dell Computers, who I think a lot of people held this guy up to be the perfect leader. But the problem is my strengths and his strengths are very, very different. And comparing yourself to other people is destructive. Everybody's unique. Everybody has their own set of strengths to bring to the table. Again, I recently posted an article about this, that there's no such thing as the ideal leader or the ideal manager. There's room for a lot of different styles, and there's room for a lot of different approaches. The most important thing in leadership to me are consistency, clear expectation setting, but most of all, authenticity. So being yourself and working to your own strengths. And when we compare ourselves to others, we overlook our own strengths, or we can overlook our own strengths. So if you are going to have a role model, try and choose one that has similar strengths to you, rather than some ideal that you're never going to live up to. Statistically as well, we've already seen the person that you're measuring yourself against, there's more than likely also experiences imposter syndrome. So what you're seeing is the edited highlights. And I know Lindsay in the chat mentioned social media. But what you see in social media are the edited highlights of somebody's life. Nobody posts, or very few people post anyway, their kids having tantrums, or their house being a mess, or the holiday that they went on that rained all the time. You only see the best of people's lives. And that's the same with if you have a leader or somebody that you look up to that experiences imposter syndrome. There's going to be a filter there that they only want you to see the best. So you don't see the imposter syndrome bubbling under the surface. You don't see the insecurities. So you may feel that you need to have it all together. That person is probably feeling the same way too. And as we've seen, 80% of adults experience imposter syndrome, 50% pretty much all the time, or identify with it all the time. Another thing as well is some people compare themselves against almost a composite of other people. So they take a bit from column A of what somebody should be, a bit from column B. So maybe you're in a management team and you think John's really good at X, or Cloda's really good at Y. And you build up a composite of what you feel you should live up to. Again, that's holding yourself up to an impossible task. You can never be something that you're not. So concentrate on your own strengths rather than somebody else. So how does imposter syndrome show up? Some pieces I've read and courses I've seen break imposter syndrome down into imposter syndromes, I should say, and their symptoms down into categories. But I find this too restrictive. Everybody's different. Everybody experiences imposter syndrome in different ways. And it's different to every individual. The important thing is that you recognize and you know if you experience imposter syndrome or not. And then you can identify the ways that it manifests in you. So what are some of the ways it manifests? Maybe again, let's pop something in the chat if you can. But if you experience imposter syndrome, how does it manifest in you? Anxiety, doubt. Thanks, Lindsay. Thanks, Colin. Anxiety again, absolutely. Low mood, anxiety, that's 3, so absolutely. And I've already said there, anxiety, it can be a cause of further mental, or it can be a cause of mental illness, and anxiety is it, or anxiety can be, extreme anxiety can be a mental illness, or can cause mental illness. Fear, absolutely, Sarah. Procrastination, yeah. Restlessness, can't stop thinking of all the fear and negative points. Yeah, Kian, thanks. Procrastination, anxiety. So all common themes that are coming up here. Absolutely. So some of the ones that I've captured here, and again, we've spoken around anxiety, and it can be a cause of that, but also perfectionism. So focusing on the smallest mistakes over and over again, trying just not to make any mistakes. Workaholism, which I'm not even sure is a real word, but I'm sure you know what it means. So overworking, trying to overcompensate for what you perceive as a skill gap, what you perceive as a lack of strength somewhere. Perhaps you want to be seen to be working harder than anybody else to make up for your perceived lack of competence. Maybe you're the first in the office, the last out the office, and you want to be seen to be that to your boss and to your colleagues and to your team. Micromanagement as well, or certainly this is something that I had to kind of overcome and make sure I wasn't doing, was micromanaging and controlling, trying to be in control of everything, for fear of, if you lose control and it goes wrong, it's going to reflect on you. And as a result of that, you don't delegate to your team, so your team don't learn anything new, they become disillusioned, and then you but also you may feel that if you delegate, you may be upstaged, or you may appear incompetent. You're asking somebody to do something else because you don't know how to do it yourself. And perhaps as a result of that, you delegate to the wrong people. You delegate to the less confident people in the team, because you think, well, they're not going to try and upstage me, rather than the people who are probably the best picks. Sarah mentioned fear of maybe asking for help or to ask questions. And if you think about this for a second, maybe you have a colleague who never seems to ask for help or never seems to ask for questions. And as a result, you feel that that colleague or that manager or that team member, or has it all together, seems to know everything already. But the chances are, again, and let's keep reflecting back to the number of people in the studies, that the chances are they have imposter syndrome too. They don't have it all together. They're just like you, they're afraid to ask questions or ask for help. Maybe they're afraid to give opinions. I certainly know of a couple of people who I've led and managed, who very rarely gave opinions in management meetings or management. And I know I've held back in the past to do it. And I've worked with people who I've almost pushed to give opinions, to cajole them to start to give the opinions, because once you do and you realize that people are listening, you become more confident of doing it. Some imposter syndrome sufferers, people who experience imposter syndrome, may feel they need to know everything. So they study, or maybe overstudy and over-research. And then I know, Phoebe, you mentioned procrastination. But you overstudy, you overthink, and then you lose the momentum on a decision, or you're too late to the table with things. Being afraid to say no, so saying yes to everything, because if you say no, again, you might come across as a failure or incompetent. Fear of failure or success I've already mentioned, and particularly the fear of success is more prevalent amongst women, particularly in male-dominated environments. What a lot of this means as well is that you can be afraid to try something new, and you stay in your comfort zone, and you're afraid to put yourself out there, maybe put yourself forward for another role, or maybe put yourself forward for a promotion, or get out of a toxic environment and go into the unknown. Maybe you just feel safe where you are, and you don't want to push yourself. A huge one, and certainly for me, was finding it hard to accept praise. And clients, there are a couple of clients I can think of that I've worked with, and one in particular springs to mind, who he's a manager in a fintech company, and his leader was telling him all the time, "You're a great manager, But in his mind, he was a terrible manager and he wanted to get out of people management. And only through working with him and speaking around imposter syndrome, we'll be able to kind of get him to accept that praise and say, look, what are people telling you? What are your people on your team telling you you're great? Your manager's telling you you're great. The only person who isn't telling you you're great is yourself. And that's the only person you're listening to. So taking the praise, taking compliments, don't brush them off. And if people do give you negative feedback, then hopefully it's constructive, but don't just focus on the negative, focus on the positive feedback you're getting as well. What imposter syndrome really does is prevent you from bringing the best version of you to your work and to your life. So you potentially hold back on your ideas, and maybe there are probably some great ideas in there that you're holding back on your opinions, not learning through failure. Learning through failure is the best way to learn. It might come across as well as negativity or standoffishness. Your team might not feel that you're supporting you because you're holding back, or your colleagues or your boss might not feel that you're participating enough. And then it becomes a vicious circle. Imposter syndromers don't perform to their best. Then they berate themselves for doing it. And we've already said, and a lot of you mentioned anxiety in there. There can be mental health implications, particularly at times of during pressure at work. I can think, again, relating it to my own experience, about 5 or 6 years ago, I joined a new company, and there was huge pressure. I know there's always pressure at the end of a quarter in a sales role and a sales team, but this was probably more pressure than I've ever experienced. And because it was a new role as well, the systems weren't really in place as well, which I took personally, and I put all the blame on myself. And this caused me not to sleep for weeks. So then I was exhausted and I wasn't able to perform anything to my best. So then it's a vicious circle, because then I was berating myself again. And eventually I left that role. So imposter syndrome in that role beat me, but I took learnings from it. And that's kind of where I am today is okay, how do I overcome this? But the survey shows that, and certainly in that experience, imposter syndromes have a lower job satisfaction than those who don't experience it. And it's not surprising if you think you're in your job and in your role for 40 hours a week. It's probably a third of your week, or a third of your weekdays anyway, are spent in work. So if you're feeling exhausted and you have low self-esteem and you feel like you're a fraud for 40 hours a week, then you're going to have lower job satisfaction. You're going to have lower life satisfaction. So any questions so far? Any comments? Anything that anybody's not sure around? Maybe pop them in the chat. So how do we overcome it? So team me up nicely there, Sarah. So we will. That is kind of the second half of the presentation. Thank you. Okay, so tackling imposter syndrome. How do we do it? As I say, I could do a full morning or even a full day on this. And I certainly edited this presentation down and had to take a lot of stuff out there. But I've kind of, here are the edited highlights of how to tackle imposter syndrome. So Albert T. Ellis is one of the pioneers of cognitive behavioral therapy, which is probably the most used therapy in treating depression, anxiety today, and a number of mental illnesses. It's based on a premise that words and thoughts create worlds, so that your perception of things is as important, and probably more, and definitely more important than the thing itself. So if you constantly feel that, or think that you're not good enough, then you'll never be good enough. But the good news in this is that our thoughts are the one thing we can 100% control more than anything else. We can't control our events, we can't control our environment, we can only influence and accept them. But the thoughts we can, that's what's inside of us. So first of all, of course, I've got a vested interest in saying this, but I do believe there is no substitute for having a coach. I couldn't do without mine. I have a coach that I meet with every 3 to 4 weeks. And certainly it's helped me overcome or deal with imposter syndrome in a lot of ways. Gave me the kind of the courage to launch my own business, but also during my last role, helped me in a huge way. If you don't already have a coach, I strongly recommend it. Then getting one. The one thing I would say though is, even though I meet with my coach every 3 to 4 weeks, there's a lot of work that I do in between sessions. And what I'm going to share with you now is what that work can be. So the second thing I would highly recommend, again, if you don't already do this, is buy a journal. Buy something to write in. Studies show, and I definitely believe this, that handwriting is better than typing for self-coaching. There's something about the hand to pen and the hand to brain connection that means it sticks more. I just get a journal from the local supermarket. It doesn't have to be anything fancy, just something to write in. And it's also good to reflect back then. So I've been journaling now for 3 years, and it's great to reflect back on the journal from 3 years ago to see how much you've grown, because you can lose sight of that in the moment. Most of all, whatever you're doing, whatever you're working on, be easy on yourself. Give yourself grace. What we want to be doing here is reprogramming your brain. Unfortunately, you're never going to completely get rid of imposter syndrome. It's always going to be there. But also remember, and also bear in mind, you're part of that 80%. You're part of the majority. You're the norm, not the exception. There's nothing wrong with you. So an important step is to think of your inner imposter, if you like, as something separate from yourself. And that makes something easier to overcome. You can argue with it. For some time now, I've pictured my imposter as a monkey that sits on my shoulder, nattering away in my ear all day. And let's just call him Monkey for the sake of presentation. I've never actually named him. He's just a monkey. Now, it's not Monkey's fault that he's an imposter. We've already seen the causes, and there can be root causes that go way back into childhood that has created Monkey. But now that since I've separated Monkey from myself, I can start to reflect on what Monkey says to me. You think I've lost it here, probably, but it works. So the other thing I use as well, and it's a technique, if anybody has experienced or studied mindfulness or gone through any mindfulness training, you may have heard a term called noting. And that's basically catching yourself in the moment, thinking or experiencing something, and using one word to note that experience. So let's say you're afraid of something. The note is fear. You can use the word fear to overcome that fear. Or if you're procrastinating, you can say procrastinating. And it's labeling something, and you can then move it to one side. So if you catch your imposter speaking to you, just use the word imposter. But I'm going to go into other ways now of catching the imposter and dealing with him or her, depending on what you name your imposter. You may already journal already, and I may be preaching to the converted on journaling, but again, I cannot recommend it highly enough. I know I posted something on my LinkedIn feed recently on this as well. But what I would say is, if you're not journaling already, or even if you aren't, it's a great way to restart or kickstart your self-coaching. What I say is, sooner rather than later, set aside some time. An hour would be ideal. And then you can spend around about 20 minutes on each question. So there are 3 kickstart questions here that I suggest you use. Whenever I'm journaling, I set myself a timer on my phone. And then during the time, I write whatever comes into my head. Even if it becomes a stream of consciousness, I force myself to write for that period of time. So in this case, if you're setting your timer for 20 minutes, just keep writing until the 20 minutes are up. If you get to the 20 minutes and still find you have things to write, then keep going until you run out of things to write. The important thing here is to stay positive. If you're imposter, if Monkey jumps in, tell him to be quiet. It's not his time. He's had his time. It's your time. So the first question really is, brainstorm all the successes in your life. So remember, this is your journal. Nobody else is likely to read this journal. So it can be anything that you put in there, anything you perceive as a success. Did you earn the camping badge at Girl Guides? Did you do a couch to 5K? Did you present something recently that went well? At any point in your life, what have been your successes to date? Remember, you've got 20 minutes, so really dig deep and brainstorm. Secondly, what are your skills and strengths? What's your knowledge? What do you know? In any aspect of your life, again, it could be, in my case, for instance, it could be, I know how to keep a tropical aquarium. It's still a skill. It's still something that I know. So again, dig deep, 20 minutes of writing. Dig deep, what do you know? What are you good at? What are your skills? Thirdly as well, what are your values? What's important to you? What do you want to live by? And then think about, are you living by those values? If you're not, think about what the impact of not living by those values are and how you can live to them. Once you've finished your journaling, or once you finish your kickstart for journaling anyway, reflect on what you've written. Maybe put the journal aside for a day and come back to it the next day and reflect on what you've written. And just consider this. How many other people have your experiences, strengths, and values in the same combination as you? So how many people have gone through your experiences, have your strengths, know what you know, and have the same values? And the answer is, even amongst 6 billion people, the answer is probably none. So what it means is two things. Obviously, A, you're unique, but B, that you don't need to be like anybody else. Because you're unique, so are they. So you can't be like them, but also because you're unique, you have something new and something fresh to bring to the table that nobody else does. And you can only be you. And remember, you're looking back at your successes, it's you that got to where you are today. So it's you that got to where you are today using your strengths and skills and knowledge. And if you think about this and really, really reflect on this, you can really silence that imposter. So I cannot recommend this enough. This is an exercise. And then as a follow-on from then, set aside some time every day to journal. Ideally 20 to 30 minutes, but even 5 to 10 minutes, even a minute is better than nothing at all. Find whenever suits you best. I do mine in the morning first. It's the first thing I do every morning, is journal, reflect on the previous day, and look towards the day ahead. And if you follow me on LinkedIn, if you don't, I will be sending an invite out after this as well, but I will be sending LinkedIn connections to everybody I'm not connected with. You'll see I regularly share questions that I use in self-coaching. I do a weekly coaching question, but there's nothing to stop you coming up with your own. And I'm going to share some techniques now with you aimed at silencing that inner imposter, that you can come up with your own questions. The first technique I want to share is called appreciative inquiry, developed by a couple of guys called David Cooper Ryder and Suresh Srivastava in the 80s. It's probably the approach I use more than any other in my coaching. It was designed for use in companies, hence the quote there is around organizations, based on the premise that organizations change in the direction in which they inquire. But this can also be applied to individuals. So it can be applied to you by you. The premise is that an organization or a person who inquires into problems will keep finding problems. Somebody who attempts to appreciate what's best in themselves will start to discover more and more of what's good. And I'm sure you can see how this will be effective in imposter syndrome and in dealing with imposter syndrome. Your imposter is the one that's churning up the negative and throwing the fear and anxiety there. So you can use appreciative inquiry to look into the positive, to look into what's good. The questions that we've just gone through in the journaling kickstart, so the successes, the strengths, the values, are all examples of appreciative inquiry. To fully go into appreciative inquiry, the coaching courses that I've done, or the main coaching course that I did, we used an entire day to go into this. But again, I'm just going to share some edited highlights for you to take away and use. So it's built around 5 principles. They each have their title, but I'm just going to go into the concepts of the principles here. But they're all centered around the belief that what we focus on creates reality. So if you think about it, this is all about retraining your brain and retraining your perception of yourself, your perception of the world as well, and the people around you. So the first principle is that positive questions amplify the positive. So momentum for change requires positive influence on relationships. The second is around the power of language, and we're going to go into this a bit more shortly. But that negative worded questions can reinforce defense mechanisms. So positive questions can create positive perceptions and realities. As I've already said, words create worlds. The third principle is that whatever we focus on grows. The fourth, and perhaps the most crucial one and then this is why journaling is so important, this is why coaching is so effective, is that the moment we begin to ask a question is the moment we begin to make a change. So that your change begins with that question. You ask yourself that question, you've begun that change. Inquiry is intervention. And the fifth principle is that people move in the direction of their images. So, and images inspire action. So if your image is of a bright future, you'll move towards that naturally. If your imposter's in the driving seat, then your images are going to be negative, and eventually so will the outcome, whether it results in anxiety or poor performance. So again, creating positive images, asking positive questions. And if we put this into a framework to use in your journaling, we can build this. There's a lot more to appreciative inquiry, as I've said, and any good coach should be well versed in it. But here are the 5 steps that you can use in your journaling every day. There's nothing to stop you coming up with questions yourself, provided they fit the principles, or the main principle of positivity. So the first step is to review. And again, if you're reviewing the day just gone or the previous day, remember, you're looking for the positives. You might be reviewing one aspect of the day. Say you had a presentation, or as I say, I reflect on the day as a whole. The approach also works if you've got something coming up. So maybe you've got a job interview coming up that you're unsure about. So think back and reflect on an interview that went well in the past. Probably the one that got you into your current role. I mean, you got your current role. So therefore that interview or series of interview worked. So again, reflect on that. But most of all, if you're doing this as part of your daily coaching, reflect on the day just gone. So the first one, what went well? What surprised you that you dealt with well? What did you value about yourself? What did you value about the experience? Again, all positive questions about the day or the event. Secondly, which of your strengths did you use? What strengths came into play? What did you communicate well? What relationships worked well? Thirdly, you can reflect as well. If you had a presentation, let's say you're reflecting back on a presentation you did in the day. Think back to, okay, what other times or experience have you observed this working well? So think on a whole. What are the similarities between today's presentation and one you did 3 weeks ago? What are the differences in a positive way? Did different strengths come into play on the other occasion than this one? And then how can you use those strengths in the future? Examine your perceptions as well. What images were in your mind across the day? What stories have you told yourself? Particularly the ones that had a positive impact, but if they were negative, what could you replace those stories with? How well did you manage your emotions across the day? Again, try and remain positive. If they are negative, try and replace them with a positive experience from another occasion to show, look, you can do this, you've got this. And the last one is, how can you apply the insights and learnings from what worked? What strengths should you focus on? What strengths of others can you leverage? We can't all be good at everything. So you know what you're strong at. Rather than call them weaknesses, there are things that you are less strong at that you know other people are strong at. Again, lean on them, use them, particularly people you trust. What possibilities are ahead of you now? Now that you've learned something new, and you learn something new every day, what possibilities are ahead of you because of this? What new goals can you set yourself? And again, I can't stress this strongly enough. The key to all of this is positivity. This isn't a post-mortem on what went wrong, because your inner imposter's already done that for you and will already do that for you. Focus on the positive. Remember, what we focus on grows. So again, the 5 steps: reflect on the day. What strengths did you use? What observations did you make? What perceptions were there? And how could you apply these to the future? I'm just reading the comments. So how do you learn to say no? I think, Peter, yeah, it's a good question. How do you learn to say no? It's about reflecting on times. When have you said no in the past? I think we're afraid of saying no because we might be letting somebody down, but also we might be coming across as incompetent. So examine what would be the worst case scenario if you said no. Examine reflect back on times you've said no in the past and what would have been the outcome. And absolutely, Sarah, we need to learn to be as kind with ourselves as we are with others. That's huge. Give ourselves grace. I'm going to go actually now into the automatic negative thoughts, because there's a piece on that around how we speak to ourselves. Because journaling is great, and that will reprogram your thought patterns over time. But a lot of the time, it's in the moment. It's those moments when somebody asks you something or gives you a task, or you're in the middle of something where you feel you should say no, to Peter's point, and your mind goes, I can't do this, or I can't say no, or I'm going to look like a fraud, and your mood changes instantly. Maybe there's a physiological effect. So maybe you can feel yourself getting hot flushes. I know sometimes when I'm in an interview situation or pressure situation, I can feel myself getting warmer and warmer. These thoughts are called automatic negative thoughts, or ANTs for short. So remember ANTs. Again, naming and noting is powerful. So if I feel an automatic negative thought, and I'll admit there are a few popped into my head during this presentation, but I'm able to say now, there's an ant. Go away, ant, almost. But there's an ant. If it comes back at a time that isn't appropriate to address it, I'll come back to that in the future. I'll come back to that when I reflect on the day, because in the moment you can't always deal with your thought in the moment. But what you can do is label it and push it to one side. Ants are a way of distorted thinking, and once we need to learn to recognize this, we can move forward to more balanced states. And particularly look for these words. There are 5 words there. Look for those words in your thoughts and what you say to others. For instance, always. Always is a huge one. I always mess up when I have one-to-ones with John, let's say, or I'll never be able to present a webinar. The last one, anybody who's watched any Tony Robbins videos or TED Talks, etc., the word should, he says, is the most dangerous word in the English language. I should be able to do exactly what Bill does. And it's a negative thought. It doesn't serve anybody. So again, if you catch yourself having an ant, you look out for the following. First of all, you're not a fortune teller. You don't know that everything's going to go wrong or things are going to go badly. But the more you think it will, the more pressure you're putting on yourself, the more you're beating yourself up. Back to Sarah's point, be nice to yourself. The more likely it will be to happen if you're not, if you're thinking that things are going to go wrong. Again, words and images create worlds. Remember, you're not a mind reader. You don't really know what other person's thinking. You may think the other person thinking you're a fraud. If they say something, it's a different matter. But again, hopefully they're telling you in a constructive manner that you can take positive learnings from. But you're not a mind reader, so you cannot guess what other people are thinking about you. Try not to take things too personally as well. If somebody blanks you or is sharp with you or is offhand with you, doesn't mean they're thinking bad things about you. I remember my first management role in Dell was in consumer sales, where my manager was a really good manager called Mary. But I remember in my first few weeks in the role, Mary didn't say a word to me. And I jumped to the immediate conclusion that Mary thought she'd made a mistake in appointing me as a manager. And I actually expressed this fear to one of my colleagues, who said, don't be silly. If Mary thought you were doing a bad job, she'd be all over you. She'd be micromanaging you. She's leaving you alone because she knows you're doing a good job. But again, I was trying to be a mind reader. I was taking things too personally. Back to Sarah's point about being kind, being nice. Don't try to stop negative self-talk. Even if it's you knock a cup of coffee over your keyboard and you call yourself a stupid idiot. That's an ant. That's you beating yourself up. You wouldn't say that to a friend, or you might do messing about, but don't berate yourself. Speak to yourself as if you're speaking to your best friend or your partner. And try not to beat yourself up. As I say, if you knock a cup of coffee over your keyboard, it was an accident. Be easy on yourself. So what to do if you experience an ant? As I say, in the moment, sometimes it's difficult because you may be in the middle of presenting a webinar or in the middle of an interview and you don't have time to go through this in your head. So again, label it, push it to one side, think, right, I'll come back to you later. But if you have time, if you find, I don't know, you're out for a walk and you're ruminating over something and it's negative, ask yourself these questions. The first one is, and try to memorize these questions. Think of these as your ant killers. So the first one, is this thought 100% true? The 100% is key here. So if you're thinking, oh, I've got to do a presentation, I'm going to fail at this because I always fail. Is that 100% true? Have there been situations where it hasn't? How do you definitely know it will happen or it will go wrong? Secondly, does this serve me? And the chances are with a negative thought, no, absolutely it won't. So why focus on it? Why focus on something that doesn't serve you and has no benefit? Thirdly, is there another way to look at this? Again, look at those reflections. Have there been other times where something has worked? But what's the other way that you can look at this particular thought? Thirdly, and I've already spoke around speaking to yourself as if you were speaking to a friend. What advice would you give to a friend if they were having this thought or they express this thought to you? It's a great way of doing it because you take yourself out of yourself for a moment. So if I was talking, imagine you're in front of your best friend and your best friend or your partner or your parent or whoever it may be says to you what you're thinking. What advice would you give to them? Go through these 4 questions. I'd say even using one of these 4 questions, you'll almost certainly see there are other ways to view the situation and ways to kill the negative thought. One last thing I'd like you to bear in mind across all of this as well, and maybe this is a good thing to do if you're having a negative thought, is think about when you're pushing, if you're pushing it away, when will you come back to it? When is the best time to journal? And this is called the basic rest and activity cycle, or the BRAC. It's basically your levels of wakefulness and energy through the day. Now, it will vary from person to person. This graph shows an average, depending on your bedtime, what time you wake up, and just you in general, what your cycles are in general. But it usually follows a similar pattern. So there is a mid-morning slump between 9 and 11, a late afternoon slump between 3 and 5. And certainly if you experience anxiety and depression as well, these things tend to go in these cycles. It also explains, and going back to occasions of anxiety, if we're under stress, we might wake up. And if you're somebody like me, who, when you're going through stressful situations, you wake up in the middle of the night. Have you ever wondered why you tend to wake up around the same time and start going over the same thoughts over and over again? That's the BRAC, that's the rest and activity cycle. And it's useful to understand this, to use noting. So if you start to have a load of automatic negative thoughts, you can say to yourself, it's my mid-morning slump. That's why I'm having ants. And if you can plan your higher pressure items for the peaks of the day, for instance, presenting a webinar, it's a good idea for me to present a webinar at noon because that's my noon peak. It might not have been a good idea to have it after lunch, which is my post lunchtime slump, which is why one of the reasons I haven't done it that way. But if you can push your ants to one side and come back to them at the peaks, and maybe try and plan your journaling around the peaks. So always bear this in mind. Be nice to yourself. Again, going back to Sarah's comment there. Celebrate your successes. While you're in your fight with your inner imposter, you need to be nice to yourself. Celebrate the wins, no matter how small. Maybe treat yourself for the bigger wins, maybe a massage or the latest iPhone or whatever it is that floats your boat. But celebrate. Again, we've spoken around taking compliments. I'm terrible at this and tend to downplay compliments. And I think of the clients I mentioned earlier who could not take praise. One of my goals is just to say thanks. You don't need to explain or explain your compliments away. Just say thanks. And bear this in mind, if somebody's paying you a compliment or praising you, remember they don't need to. chances are they're going out of their way to do it, and that they plan to do it. You don't need me to lecture you on this, but look after yourself physically, sleep well, eat properly, get moving. I also strongly recommend meditation if you don't already do it. I do around 10 minutes a day using an app called Calm. I know there's another app called Headspace out there, but whatever it is to work from you, it makes a huge difference. Lastly, and probably most importantly, don't be afraid to fail. And if you do, learn from it. It's really the best way and the only way to learn is through failure. If we don't push ourselves, we don't learn anything new. But when you do reflect in a positive way. Stay away from those always and nevers, and especially shoulds. And think of how you've learned from the experience and what the positives you can take. Like any emotional experience, like any, I know it's not a mental illness, but like any mental experience, talking around it, connecting with others, talk to someone you trust is key. I suppose the essence of this presentation is acknowledging your feelings through journaling, through catching yourself in the moment, through thinking about where you are and noting. As I've said before, I strongly recommend getting a coach, somebody who's neutral to you, outside of your business and social circle, and think of it as an investment in yourself. For the sake of maybe €100 a month, you can work on your confidence, your self-esteem, and getting rid of that imposter. So if you don't already have a coach, I strongly recommend getting one. Obviously, again, vested interest. If you enjoyed today's session and you feel like you'd like to work with me, I will be following up with an email and a survey on the course, but you can book a free slot at calendly.com. As well as coaching as well, even if you do know me, I offer a strengths finder tool called StrengthScope, which can help you to understand your own strengths. There's also a 360, which can help you get the opinion of others on those strengths. And again, you may want to work with me on this one. I've also set up I'm going to invite you a LinkedIn group for managers to discuss any issues in a safe and supportive environment. It's brand new, and I'll be sharing some content on there. But most of all, it'll be what the members make of it. So feel free to spread the word as well. Invite other managers in your network to the group. So thank you for joining today. I hope that was useful. As I say, I will be following up this up with a survey. I will be posting the video on my website as well. And I'll put a link to that in my survey email. But before we wrap up, does anybody have any questions, any comments, any concerns? Just going through the comments here. So some positive feedback from Clodagh there, thank you. Yeah, Colin, why are you feeling like that? What facts are you basing that on? What do you know? Great questions. It's very important to focus on the present. Are you not future possibilities in what we can, absolutely, and that's appreciative inquiry in essence, Sarah, is focusing on the present. What can you actually change, but in a positive way, not focused on too much on the negative. I say, because the imposter is already doing that with you. So if there are no other questions, I'm going to stop recording now anyway. Is there a book that you could recommend to? Is there a book that you can recommend to learn more? Let me think about that. I actually haven't been. Actually, yes, there is. It's one that I'm reading at the moment. This isn't necessarily about imposter syndrome, but a lot of the imposter syndrome stuff that I've gone through there is from, if you look up an author called Martin Seligman, this one is called Learned Optimism. Highly recommend this. But there is a lot, and Sarah just put a link in the chat there as well, around, there's a lot online. Again, I'll put that column in the follow-up email, but anything by Martin Seligman is around positive psychology. And they're really good books. Sarah, no, I'm not going to sing next time. Just, thank you anyway. So thank you everybody for joining. Again, hope you got something out of that. I will be following up with a survey, as I said. So if you could complete that, it would be great. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.